Of course, I said, and fetched a towel to transfer the boiling teapot from the stove onto a block set aside for it. I poured 3 cups of tea and added honey. Mr. Valiant came downstairs dressed for the funeral as I was stirring the cups. Watch out, he told me. She'll have you cooking if you let her. I didn't know what to say, so I ducked my head and hoped for the best. He laughed loudly and took his tea. We'll be going into the forest today, Mary said, and joining you in town later. He grunted assent, apparently used to his daughter making her own way. For breakfast, Mary boiled oats laced with more honey, and we ate in a companionable silence, marked by the ticking of the empty loom as it slowed down. The quiet and darkness folded around us in a green-tinged twilight that gave the lie to the early hour. Mary led the way, pausing here and there to pick a handful of green herbs or bright yellow elfwort that she put in her bag. We walked a long way without her, slackening her pace. I admired the certainty of her steps and the steadiness of her breath. I also did my best to keep from panting too loudly as we walked uphill. Finally, she slowed and started singing softly. She reached back and held my hand as if we were children, leading me along a narrow path above a river gorge. We climbed higher and soon came upon a chattering waterfall our own height, with pools above and below. Mary sat on a rock next to the top pool and pushed back the loose strands of hair. I sat beside her, hoping I didn't sting of sweat after the hike. This is the same river as the one in Hollowvale, she said. Adam taught me to fish here. She laid her head on my shoulder, and I tried not to move as she wept, wetting my neck with her tears. At last she stood and walked around gathering wildflowers, casting them into the water one by one, and watching them tumble down the waterfall and sink, bruised and torn on the other side. I watched the water and wished I knew what to say to comfort her. Then I saw the bear. Knox stood in the trees on the other side of the falls, starkly white against the rocks of the gorge, watching me with those eyes. I took Mary's arm and gently pulled her back towards the path. When she lifted her head and began walking at her usual pace, I let go of her and fell behind, trying not to imagine Knox's meaty breath on my neck. I looked back, but couldn't see Knox anymore. When we passed out of sight of the falls, I looked back more and more frequently. There was no sign of Knox, but that didn't mean we were safe. We arrived back at Hollowvale's outskirts and slipped into the funeral crowd. I had never felt relieved to be surrounded by mourners before. The local church had burned to the ground along with the previous Soul Eater, so the funeral took place in Hollowvale's open square, within sight of both the ruined church and the forest's edge. Hollowvale sat at the centre of two valleys, with houses sprawling comfortably in each valley, while leaving the centre of the village cramped between two steep hills. The choice to keep a central village square meant that the graveyard was next to the church instead of behind it. I wondered how Hollowvale citizens felt about having a graveyard in the middle of their most public area. Perhaps it had been the simplest way to unite the two villages into one. Although we were still outside, there were enough people around that I felt safe. Funeral attendants were busy trying to light the furnace inside, the engine that would lower Adam and his bier into its final resting place. I drew Mary deeper into the crowd and then looked back at the forest. There was no sign of Knox. I kept a sharp eye on the trees, not trusting the apparent reprieve. The funeral preparations took time, as they should. Mary took a deep breath and went to stand beside her aunt at the graveside. The fire crackled slowly into life, sending grey clouds across the village and blocking the weak springtime sunlight. The boiler spat and steamed, and at last Adam's bier moved slowly downwards, accompanied by the clanking of the engine. His body was obscured by smoke and steam and by a pack of curious children dirtying their mourning clothes as they gathered to watch. Every last Hollowvale citizen filed past the open grave, dropping flowers and mouthing prayers. Adam's extended family filed past a second time to drop tears and handfuls of dirt. Adam had been loved, and the outpouring of grief pressed on my skin like cold, heavy hands. More than one young woman wept immoderately, jealous that death had taken him. Mary gave me a sly glance, and I almost laughed despite everything. The steam engine was finally banked and hauled away from the grave. Brave men uncoupled the boiler and set it aside for brave women to harvest its water for tea making. The twice-baked coal they used was odorless and wouldn't ruin the taste. Other people gathered with unbaked bread and salted strips of the same wild boar that had killed Adam Valley. They cooked them all on a griddle placed over the engine and piled the prepared food on platters that were emptied as quickly as they were filled. The mood turned nostalgic as Adam's life changed in the telling from an unremarkable existence into an epic tale of unusual handsomeness and courage. The prettiest young women burst into tears once more and then drowned their sorrows with plentiful wine. As night fell, the coal in the steam engine settled into embers. Funeral attendants scraped them out to make a new fire closer to the village centre than the fresh grave. Someone played music. Mayor Valley left before the funeral turned into a party, pulling her maidservant in her wake. I was exhausted. It had been a long time since I'd stayed somewhere long enough to see people either weep or dance. It was slowly dawning on me that my secret was out now. I was a soul eater. More than anything, I felt relieved. No more hiding. And then people started talking to me, about the weather, the food, the drink, and everything else that wasn't anything. I slowly realized that I was the closest thing they had to Adam. It was eerie, playing the role of a ghost. Mary brought a child to me, introducing him as Barnaby. He stared at me in delighted relief. "You were right," he cried. "I can see Adam." "Only his soul," Mary corrected him gently. "But we can't speak with him, but he's safe and cared for." I stumbled backwards, knowing what Barnaby was. He was a soul-eater like me, but so powerful he could see the souls of others. Mary led the child away, throwing me an apologetic look. I went and stood uncomfortably close to the bonfire with my back to the village, using the glaring flames to blind myself. After a time, I sensed Mary beside me and dipped my head to acknowledge her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't realize Barnaby would upset you." "Not your fault," I said. "It was just habit. I've tried to avoid strong soul eaters for years. They can see right away that I'm carrying a soul. 2 souls now, in addition to my own. I didn't want to be hauled away to the soul school." "Do you have to take Barnaby away for training?" she asked. I didn't need to see her to know she was shaking with fear at the thought. "No," I said, turning towards her. "I'd never do such a thing, but others might. He should be careful if he wants to choose his own path in life." Mary nodded. "I'll talk to him tomorrow. As far as I know, no one knows but you and I. Until today, I only suspected."